Some years ago, I drove up into the high, cold, dark mountains behind Los Angeles, and just near the top, where there was almost snow on the ground, I pulled into a rough parking lot, and there was a stooped man in tattered black robes and woolen cap who was waiting to greet me there. And when I got out of my car, he gave me a deep ceremonial bow, and he insisted on carrying my things into the cabin where I was to stay, and then he started cooking me dinner, and then he even asked me if I needed a wife. And it took me a while to realize that this ragged monk was my hero since boyhood, the great singer and poet Leonard Cohen, who had already been celebrated for 30 years for his beautiful suits and glamorous girlfriends. And even though Leonard Cohen is the last word in cool and the ultimate man of the world, he had decided to spend 5.5 years, not 5.5 minutes, not 5.5 months, but 5.5 years living as a Zen monk, shoveling snow, scrubbing floors, and most of all, tending to the then 88-year-old Japanese head of the Mount Baldy Zen Center. And one night, very late, he came down into my cabin and told me that just sitting still, being unplugged, looking after his friends, was, as he put it, the real deep entertainment that the world had to offer, the most profound and voluptuous and delicious excitement that he had ever found. This was not what I wanted to hear. He had been my hero since boyhood because of his romantic lifestyle and his constant travels and his worldly and hugely successful songs. He had tasted all the pleasures that sex and drugs and rock and roll have to offer. And yet, there was no doubting his sincerity, his kindness, and his attentiveness. I have met a lot of interesting people in my 32 years as a journalist, and I had never met anybody so gracious, so humble, so articulate, and so funny as Leonard Cohen. Before we end, I'd love to return to our man on the mountain, Leonard Cohen. And after his 5.5 years as a monk, he came back into central Los Angeles, only to find that in his absence, somebody had made off with all the millions that he had earned over 45 years, everything he was planning to give to his daughter and his son. And so at the grand old age of 73, he went on tour again. And over the next 6 years, he gave more than 300 concerts everywhere from Turkey to Australia. And just near the beginning of his tour, I went to see him down the road here at the Nokia Theatre, and he was riveting. He ran onto the stage. He sang for more than 3 hours. He kneeled down before his fellow musicians. And most of all, he commanded the space with his power, with his whispers, even with his silences. And many people said at the end of the evening that was the greatest concert they had ever seen. And I think in part because he wasn't trying to sell us anything, he wasn't trying to make an impression on us, but even more because his 5 years of sitting still had released in him a tremendous sense of movement and energy and intimacy and depth. Just 4 years after that, I was again staying at the LA Live Center in the JW Marriott, where some of you may be spending tonight. And one morning I walked down to the Starbucks to get my awake tea, and I suddenly heard this familiar voice grumbling on the soundtrack. And it was Leonard Cohen, then 77, singing from his then new album, Old Ideas, which was the featured album of the week in Starbucks. And in spite of its title, Old Ideas had gone to #1 in the charts in 17 nations across the planet. His old song, Hallelujah, had become the quickest downloaded single in European history. In fact, at one point, Hallelujah was #1, #2, and #34 on the British charts. In other words, he had become the prince of fashion, once again, one of the most successful and coveted singers on the globe. And just 2 days after he turned 80, last September, he brought out another album. He's working on a new one just a couple of miles from where we are sitting. But much more important, if you go and visit him in the very modest house he shares with his daughter and his granddaughter, you will meet the kindest father and grandfather and host that you could imagine. And he radiates a sense of happiness and wisdom and peace that I think are what we mean when we talk about success.